Good morning. It's good to see everyone here. Thank you for joining us for class. Thank you for all of our guests that we have with us. We hope that the things that we study will be helpful to all of us as we go back to the law and find how it is still encouraging and equipping for us today. Thank you to Stephen for filling in last minute on Wednesday whenever I got sick. I'm feeling better. I'm still going to probably give some fist bumps today just to be safe so I don't share anything. But I don't think I'm contagious anymore. But I do appreciate him filling in and covering what needed to be covered on lesson 2. He said something in the stream about how that I was going to be super mad that he only got through 1 or 2 questions. However, that was the main thing I wanted to get across, is that the law is still, in a sense, authoritative, and that it does equip us to know the salvation that is in Jesus Christ. And so that was the main thing I wanted to cover. And as we move into lesson number 3 this morning, we're going to be talking about quotations and allusions, both in lesson 3 and in lesson 4. But we're going to be looking at the Old Testament use of the Pentateuch in this lesson. And then on Wednesday, and I will be away at the Profitable for Teaching classes on Wednesday, and so Matt Davis has graciously offered to substitute for me. And so we're going to be discussing how the rest of the Bible uses the law, the Pentateuch. And I will say that there are far more quotations in the New Testament than there are in the Old Testament. So when we look at Joshua to Malachi, we're not going to find as many direct quotations of Genesis through Deuteronomy, but we do find several allusions. And so we'll be looking at some of those either direct quotations or direct allusions in the rest of the Old Testament. And again, this is to demonstrate that not only do Genesis through Deuteronomy tie together in a perfect unity, but also the law perfectly unites with the prophets and the writings, the Psalms. So we'll kind of show some of those connections. Obviously, this can't be comprehensive, but we're going to hit some of the highlights, and then I've offered in the questions for you to share some of your own findings as we work our way through. All right, so let's begin by looking at some of the key concepts that keep getting repeated throughout. And again, this is not exhaustive, but I've tried to choose some of the main themes that I see throughout the Pentateuch, and notice how that those keep on getting repeated throughout Joshua through Malachi. And so we'll look at some direct connections there, and you'll have an opportunity to share some of the verses that you found that fit into those themes, those allusions and quotations. And then we'll move on to specific sections of the Old Testament, historical books, the wisdom literature, and the prophets. All right, so let's begin by taking a look at this first key concept that is introduced in the Pentateuch that then gets carried through the rest of the Old Testament, and that is creator-creation, or creation-creator, as it's written here. And as you look at that in the Pentateuch, what are some key texts that you found that show this concept of God creator and cosmos creation, or humanity creation? Did you find anything?
Psalm 104, basically the entire psalm.
All right, Psalm 104. And what are some highlights that you saw there that tie us directly back to the Pentateuch?
Number 1, you're clothed with honor and majesty, from the latter portion of verse 1. Verse 2, he lays the beams of his upper chambers in the waters and makes the clouds his chariot, walks on the wings of the wind. Verse 5, you laid the foundations of the earth so that it should not be moved forever. And then we have several examples of different ways that he provides for his creation. Verse 14, he causes the grass to grow for the cattle and the vegetation for the service of man, that he may bring forth fruit from the earth. Verse 19, he appointed the moon for seasons. The sun knows it's going down, and so on and so forth. So several. It's kind of like a sample. Whoever wrote this, I forget who wrote this one. I guess we have an attribution. Whoever wrote this said, okay, I read verses 1 and 2 of Genesis. Now I'm just going to think about what are all of the what falls out from that? What are the consequences? What are all the things that God must have had his hand in order to bring this creation about and set it in motion?
Excellent. I'm thankful that you brought up that psalm, but also just the psalms in particular connected to creation. because as a side point, that does help us to recognize that here is what it looks like when you poetically tell the story of creation versus when you tell it historically or in a narrative context like Genesis chapters 1 and 2. And so if you ever hear people say, well, we really don't know how the earth was created, how long ago it was created. This Genesis 1 was not meant to be written as history. Here's what it looks like when you write it as poetry. And yet there is a connection. Obviously, there is more imagery in Psalm 104 or the other Psalms of creation, but there is definitely a distinction between those two. And yet, you can take that historical account in Genesis 1 and 2, and you can show how it connects to even how they worshiped God in their poetry. Any other things you found about creation, Pentateuch, and the rest of the Old Testament?
Job 38, when God is speaking to Job, and where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth, and just goes on from there to describe all the elements and the things that he has control over. Just goes back and just declares God's creation and his power over.
Very good. And I appreciate that there, again, you do have kind of poetic structure throughout that middle section of Job. And yet, as God is speaking, he ties creation to his power. And I think this is important that we sometimes will look for the facts and we don't necessarily look at the implications of those facts. Job 38 is a good implication of the facts. Genesis 1 was not merely written to tell us what happened at creation. It's meant to tell us something about God. And so the Pentateuch is laying down the foundations of who is God, and then we're seeing that fleshed out in the rest of the Old Testament, in Psalms, in Job. Was there another hand back here? Brother Sam?
Genesis 1 and verse 2, where it talks about the earth was without form and void, and there was darkness on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And Jeremiah chapter 4 and verse 23 says, I beheld the earth, and indeed it was without form and void, and the heavens they had no light. So just a reference back to the time before the Lord really formed everything.
Very good. And what we're going to see as we get into the prophets is that they will often take these literal, real stories that occurred, and then they will repeat those and apply them in kind of a figurative or theological sense. And Jeremiah will do that with the decreation of the nation and then the recreation of the nation. And so what I'm trying to show is not only do we see connection points where they saw this as literal history, but they also saw the implications for themselves. And I think that's important connections to make as we study the Old Testament, as we study the law, is that this is not merely history to tell us what happened. It is also history to tell us what should happen for God's people.
I was just going to say that decreation is connected there. You see it starting with the flood, where you almost have a reversal of the creation narrative in chapter 7. But then you also see a lot of that similar language in judgments that come, where it's, everything is gone, animals, growing things, all, it's a taking away of the creation that God meant for his people.
Excellent. Any other thoughts, sir?
33:6, your connection there about power in creation and stuff, which is where I thought you were going when you asked the question. Where he says, by the word of the Lord, the heavens were made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth, which is just beyond our understanding in some ways.
Very good. And that's another point that I would like to bear out, is that they saw the implications of that God created everything by his word. They didn't read that story and say, well, everything's been eternal, and then God spoke light into this kind of eternal material substance. Psalmist looks and says, he spoke the heavens into existence. So when we read Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, they, by inspiration, could look back and say, God created everything out of nothing, and he did it through his powerful word. And so that there are even implications to the power of the word of God in connection with that as well. All right, number 2, we see in the Pentateuch the introduction of the concept of sin. Where do we see that most clearly as the introduction of sin in the Pentateuch? Adam and Eve, Genesis chapter 3. We see that kind of continuing with the Cain and Abel story and then with the pre-flood environment. But we also see sin as a concept throughout Israel's history in Exodus through Deuteronomy. And so when you see that concept of sin, what are some other Old Testament connections that tie us directly back to that Pentateuchal story?
Daniel chapter 9, when Daniel is praying on behalf of Israel after they've been taken into captivity. Verse 11 says, "Indeed, all of Israel has trespassed against your law, even turning aside, not listening to your voice. So the curse has been poured out on us along with the oath which is written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, for we have sinned against him." He says somewhat the same thing in 13. So it's a reminder of the commitment that Israel made when Moses got them all back together, and he's saying this is what happened, and it was already laid out what was going to happen when we failed, and it's happened. So.
Very good. And those echoes are important. And notice here's a connection when we think about this idea, is that we go from the story of a disorderly world, that God creates it, and it's disordered, and so he has to order it in the 6 days. Then we see that decreation in the flood, and then recreation, and then we see decreation, recreation. Here's another echoing of what really happened, is that you have sin leads to curse with Adam and Eve. What do you have? The promise of sin will lead to a curse in Deuteronomy. Then you see that fulfilled even more as you go to the prophets of, look, this is exactly how this has happened. And so we're seeing a lot of these repetitions. And what that demonstrates is not that you just have some literary geniuses out there who are picking themes and trying to weave them together. It's that we see that this story has always been forward-looking, and that you have these events that happen in the Pentateuch that then God inspires people to use those stories, to use those things that they are familiar with in order to highlight their present reality. Isn't that what we do in sermons as well? Is that we're saying, look at what happened back then, and then now we can see how that has a fulfillment with us as well. And obviously, it's different between preachers today preaching and the prophets speaking by inspiration, but we're seeing a similar idea. And when we talk about prophets in a little bit more in later studies, what we'll find is that they are the spokesman of the law. They're the Old Testament restorationists. They're tying people back to the law.
I think too, and that even becomes that promised land type, and then they are cast out in sin, and so the same thing happens with Israel. They're cast out of that land, and that's a repetition of that.
Yes, absolutely. Good point. Any other thoughts?
I'll just go back to your Adam and Eve, which you brought up in the beginning. Think about Proverbs chapter 3. I think the book of Proverbs really leans on the Pentateuch in many ways. But a passage we're all familiar with, trust Yahweh with all your heart, do not lean on your own understanding, in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear Yahweh and turn away from evil. That reminds me of Genesis 3, 5, and 6, where Eve is seeing the light in the eyes, makes one wise, things like that. But then as you go in Proverbs chapter 3 down, verse 13 says, how blessed is the man who finds wisdom. And then in 18, she is a tree of life to those who sees her. So it's bringing us back to that garden scene of what I think Proverbs is doing in many ways, is presenting two paths. You go down this path, it leads to the tree of life. You go down this path over here, it's going to lead ultimately to destruction and death. And so he's highlighting those things to help his readers not be like Eve, ultimately.
Excellent. Very good. All right, let's move on to the third one here, atonement. Where do you see atonement in the Pentateuch? What comes to mind first and foremost when you hear the word atonement? Leviticus. That's what I thought as well. I will say there is the possibility that you even have it introduced in Genesis chapter 3, but we'll talk about that at a different time. But Leviticus, atonement, 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 atonement. And I think one of my favorite passages in Leviticus is 17:11, where it says that the life of the flesh is in the blood. And very emphatically, God says, I myself have given this to you for atonement. And so he indicates that he is the source of this sacrificial system, the atonement possibility. Where do we see this concept of atonement echoed beyond the Pentateuch? What are some examples?
Second Chronicles 29, verses 23 and 24, talks about, this, the offering, the sin offering, the atonement that's available, because of the
Very good. We must have been writing down notes at the same time and syncing with one another, because I had 2 Chronicles 29 and 24 as well. And obviously that theme is picked up even in figurative ways when you get to some of the prophets who talk about atonement that is going to be offered and the sacrifices that will be offered that are ultimately fulfilled in the Messiah. And we'll probably just deal with that a little bit more when we get to the New Testament allusions. But this is connected. Atonement is also connected to a fourth major concept that is introduced in the Pentateuch, and that is covenant. And when you think the word covenant, what comes to mind from Genesis through Deuteronomy? There's a couple of different things you could think about. Abraham, Mount Sinai. There's one actually before that as well.
Rainbow.
Noah. So Noah, Abraham, patriarchs, and then Sinai. These are the big covenants, if you will, of the Pentateuch. And I think covenant is, if not the major theme, it is at least one of the major sub-themes of the entire book of the law, the Pentateuch. Covenant is undergirding everything that is connected to the promises made to Abraham, the promises made to Israel. Concept of covenant is that God is entering into a relationship with his people, and covenant at that time, I think especially when you're looking at the superiority of God, as of course the Pentateuch highlights this concept of the sovereignty and the power of God. When you have that kind of a context in play, it's not that this is an agreement between equals. This is God coming in and saying, this is who I am, this is what I've done, this is what I expect of you. And this is what you will receive if you stay in covenant faithfulness with me, just as I promise to be in covenant faithfulness with you. That's a concept that gets explored further and further in the rest of the Old Testament. And for time's sake, let me just take us over to Nehemiah chapter 9. Nehemiah chapter 9. And we actually have several echoes to the Pentateuch in Nehemiah chapter 9. I would note that in verse 6, he first begins with the God is creator. But then as you drop down to verses 7 and 8, it says, you are the Lord God who chose Abraham and brought him from Ur of the Chaldees and gave him the name Abraham. You found his heart faithful before you and made a covenant with him to give him the land of the Canaanite, of the Hittite, of the Amorite, of the Perizzite, of the Jebusite, and the Girgashite, to give it to his descendants, and you have fulfilled your promise. For you are righteous. So notice that as Nehemiah is kind of looking at the history of Israel, what's he say? You're creator, and you're the one who makes the covenant. Creation and covenant are the things on which he is going to base the rest of his appeal to God. And he is referencing these stories in Genesis not as the myths of the Israelites, but as real history. This poem loses all force if Abraham was not a real person with whom God made a promise and a covenant. And so we see this idea of the connection of covenant, that they are tying themselves to Abraham by covenant. That this covenant was extended to the patriarchs. This covenant was extended to all the seed of Abraham. And as we know, the New Testament gives us even more information, because it's not just the physical seed of Abraham, but it is all who can become seed of Abraham in Jesus Christ. So we have this picture of covenant. And again, I think even the covenant could be a theme that is introduced in Genesis chapter 3 as well. Now finally, we have this broad theme of holiness. And again, I think these last three are somewhat connected, and maybe even the last four, of sin needs atonement, that there is a covenant, which ought to demonstrate holiness. Where do we see holiness kind of first introduced in the Pentateuch? I'll give you a hint. Every theme I've had so far has at least in some way been introduced in Genesis 1 through 3, but there are other concepts as well.
I was going to point out, so I put down Exodus 15, which, 15:13 is what I had. But where it's pointed out that God's habitation, where he lives, where he dwells, that itself is holy.
Excellent. Very good. And so we see holiness introduced in Exodus. Why? Because he's making a holy people. That is developed even further when you get to the book of Leviticus. I would say maybe some introduction to a concept of holiness is even in Genesis chapter 2, where God sets apart the Sabbath day. And so you have some concepts that are circling throughout the Pentateuch. How does the rest of the Old Testament kind of pick up on this Pentateuchal theme of holiness and then kind of either extend it or hearken back to it? What are some thoughts? Brother Sam?
I think about in Hannah's prayer when she was praying. She says, "No one is holy like the Lord." So that concept had been understood and was being used by those in Israel many centuries later.
So they recognized that God had revealed himself as a holy God, and they continue to echo that sentiment. What else?
I think the presence of God there in Exodus 3 and Exodus 19, and then so you see that, for instance, in Isaiah coming into the throne room singing, you see that in Ezekiel every time he encounters the presence of the Lord, just over and over, that same sort of continuation of Exodus 20, the way it's described, and then it's described in similar terms in these other places. So.
Excellent. Very good. So the holiness of God definitely picked up in some of these later stories. Anything else you came up with?
Maybe the reverse of that, the idea that God is holy, and so not just anybody can approach him. So we have folks who do not respect that distance that they have to keep, such as Uzziah, who went into offer incense. He was not consecrated to do so.
Excellent. And this is something that we could, if we had time, develop a little further, is that with all of these positive concepts that are revealed in the Pentateuch, something that is part of investigating or exegeting or interpreting these positive concepts is that there's usually some negative concepts that it exposes. So if you have a concept of holiness, now you have a concept of common. If you have a concept of all-powerful creator, that means anything lesser is not worthy of worship. And so when some people say, we just need to preach the positive concepts and we never need to expose any of the false concepts, that's not even how they dealt with the Pentateuch. When they used the Pentateuch, they said, here are the foundations of our faith. They build on those foundations, and then they say, anything not this needs to be exposed and removed from God's people. So good point there. Any additional thoughts there? All right. Marshall's going to be really angry. All right. All right, let's go to the second section here. As we move into these next several sections, we'll move through fairly quickly because we've been dealing with this whole concept of connection points. But if there were any that kind of jumped out at you, I want us to think through them. And we're going to take them in sections, first with the historical books. And as you looked at some of those passages, what were some of the connection points? What was maybe one that you found particularly interesting as a connection point to the Pentateuch? Or was there one that was not listed that you kind of thought of on your own, specifically from the historical books? And then the main thing I want us to keep in mind is, as we point out these connections, can we see why they used the Pentateuch? Or what was the purpose in the immediate context for referring back to the books of the law? So what was something that jumped out at you in the historical books?
I think one was the command for each king of Israel to write down the words of the law and to use that as he would rule. And you stop and think about the importance of when you write something down, how much greater you remember it than if you just read it. And so that concept to me was, something that unfortunately many of the kings of Israel did not eat.
Very good. And are you going to still be on Kings? I'll come right back to you, Stephen. While we're on Kings, isn't it interesting how God says this is what a king should do in Deuteronomy? This is what he shouldn't do. And then what is the entire narrative of Samuel through Kings talking about? Where kings are doing what God said not to do, or on the rare occasion where they are actually doing what God said to do. And what happens? You see the exact results of what Deuteronomy said. And so notice that they are tying back to the prophecies of Moses, saying this is what has happened to us. And really, when you're looking at Samuel and 1 Kings, it's saying this is how we got here. It's because we did not obey Deuteronomy. And so they're tying it back to the authority of Deuteronomy and saying this is how we got to where we are. Now, you have a slightly different take after the exile with the chronicler, but again, he's still tying us back to the law in many ways. Stephen?
I think in Joshua 1:8, we've got the continuation of the language. This is the same things we saw in Deuteronomy being carried now forward. And so it's to make sure we maintain that connectivity to, this is not, today when we have a new administration, basically we dump on everything of the old administration. We want to maintain and carry forward this administration. And I think that is a constant appeal to the history. In First Chronicles, I think those whole first 9 chapters are to tie them back to the history that they probably felt pretty disconnected from coming back from Babylon, and it's to reroute them into that story of who they are and who they are in relationship to God, to Moses, etc.
Excellent. And to extend that point just a little bit, let me show my hand since I won't be here to show it on Wednesday. The reason I put these 2 lessons in this material is to show that the Pentateuch is the foundation. The Old Testament draws from it at so many points. Basically, it is the foundation of the rest of the Old Testament. But then the New Testament writers just keep extending and are still building on that foundation. So the law, Paul establishes the law. Why? Because it's the foundation of everything that we are a part of. And to use the imagery that Stephen brought up, it's not like Jesus comes and says, hey, there's a new king in town, I'm going to dump everything that came before, dump on everything that came before. He is saying this is the extension of everything we've been looking forward to. It is what it is in Christ. And so we should constantly be seeing and looking at all of these passages, we are seeing this as not a removal of a system, but the extension to something that it was always looking forward to. All right, any other thoughts on the historical books?
The passage that you cited or brought to our attention in Judges 2, where, just to try to say it briefly, God says, I delivered you from Egypt, I gave you the land that I promised to your fathers, we made a covenant that you have not kept. I mean, you want to talk about a constant refrain that goes through every single book from this point forward, with the possible exception of Job, I guess. But pretty much the whole rest of the Old Testament is, I did this for you. I made this promise. You made this promise to me. You haven't kept up your end of the bargain.
Yes. And I think this is something that's helpful as we are talking about the trustworthiness of the Bible with people who aren't Christians or with people who are Christians. It's kind of like that series that Stephen did on Matthew and Moses. If we can show the interconnectivity of Scripture, that this is not just a bunch of disconnected books, because if you don't have a framework, it sounds very disconnected sometimes if you don't have the language already in your heart. But when you start to see all the connections, see how the story begins, see how it extends, it's always tying back and forth between the two, that points to a superintending influence that is God who is putting this all together. All right, now let's take a look at the wisdom literature. And what were some of the things that jumped out most to you as far as connection points between wisdom literature and the law, the Pentateuch?
Well, I mean, obviously Psalm 119, I think, is sort of representative of, it presents it as the ideal, the foundation of everything. I love it, I want to
And you know, even Psalm 19, the law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. You know, I think some people look at that and say, well, they were just doing the best at their time with what they thought about the law. But really, perfect, converting the soul? Yes. And so we have this picture of the psalmists are taking the law. And we already saw some examples of this where they're taking the story of creation. They're taking the story of the giving of the law at Sinai. They're taking some of the key characters in their history and saying, we are in line with them. We are their descendants, if you will. God, the Creator, is our God. The God of Sinai is our God. And they're trying to tie this, and even the lament songs, what are they doing? They're appealing back to the trustworthiness of God as revealed in the stories of Israel's history in order to say, now do what you have done before with us. And so we're seeing these pictures of God working among his people in history in the Pentateuch. Now we're seeing the appeal for the same kind of work in their lives. Any other thoughts on the wisdom?
So all throughout Proverbs, it keeps going back to God being the God of wisdom, and the act that most shows that is his power in creation and what he did in creation. In chapter 8, I think is one of the kind of pinnacles of where there's so much concentrated on wisdom being with God, being at the beginning of time, and creation being the thing that exemplifies that the most.
Excellent. And so watch for, and I'll get to you in just a second, Mr. Sam. Watch for those themes as you're reading through, doing a whole Bible reading. Don't just look for what's happening here. Look at what they're tying back to, or look at what they're pointing forward to. Never miss how God is revealing things to his people that would tie them back to their roots, but also point forward to the Christ. And so we're looking for this unity of purpose, this unity of story, that we get to be drawn into that same history. That because Christ has come into this world, now we can have Abraham as our forefather. Now we can have Moses as our leader in a sense, because all of that has been fulfilled in Jesus. That even if we don't have Jewish blood in us, unlike Brian, who is our resident Jew, he told me about that on Sunday, we don't necessarily have a physical connection to these stories, but we do have a spiritual connection in Jesus Christ. So I just got Brian a lot of conversation points after class.
As a Jew, I'd like to say that. So the book of Proverbs, as I said earlier, leans on Pentateuch a lot, and I think about the book of Proverbs really is Solomon's way of saying, here's how you apply the Torah to your life. Here's how you live it out each and every day, and the wisdom literature for that matter. But it takes all these rules and regulations and commandments, and it says there's more to it than just that surface. It's sort of like what Jesus does in the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, "You've heard, do not murder, but I say to you, do not hate your brother in your heart." Well, that's what Proverbs does. It says here's all these commandments, but you can find the 10 Commandments in the book of Proverbs, generally speaking, and it tells you how to apply it to your life, how to live it out. And so, as New Testament Christians who go to Proverbs a lot, it teaches us how the Torah can really affect our life as well.
Absolutely. And, even if we don't have the word law all the time, even think about the book of Ecclesiastes that doesn't necessarily appeal to it very much in the opening section. What's it do at the very end, at the climax? Fear God and keep his commandments. And so we have this picture of tie yourself back to the law. That's the only way to kind of transcend this very difficult, toilsome, and burdensome life, is to see that the God of covenant is the same one the God of the covenant is the same one that you should fear and obey, because a day of judgment is coming. All right? In 2 to 3 minutes, someone summarize everything that the prophets say about the Pentateuch. Now, what are some interesting connection points that you saw that kind of show that they are the proclaimers of law for God's people?
Well, you had Isaiah 1, verse 10, that mentions Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah for them is kind of like Hitler for us. It's the ultimate of all the evil, nothing worse than this world ever I mean, I say that slightly tongue in cheek, but certainly Sodom and Gomorrah is a picture that gets brought up more than once in the prophets as either, I'm going to make you just like them, or you would have been just like them, except that I showed you mercy. And again, to your point earlier, if that didn't actually happen, that's a rather hollow point.
Right. And so, yes, we're seeing these echoes of this is real history. Now, here's a figure of what that looks like among you, that you've become Sodom, you've become Gomorrah in both your sinfulness and the result if you continue in your sinfulness. I will add in that it is interesting that Eden is pictured from time to time in the prophets. We don't necessarily have time to develop that further, but there is one thing I wanted to touch on before we leave this point in Micah 6, 3 through 5. I think this speaks to a point that I've been trying to make throughout these connection points and the application points for their time, which would then help us in our applying of the law. In Micah 6, verse 3, "My people, what have I done to you, and how have I wearied you? Answer me. Indeed, I brought you up from the land of Egypt, and ransomed you from the house of slavery, and I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, my people. Remember now what Balak king of Moab counseled, and what Balaam son of Beor answered him, and from Shittim to Gilgal, so that you might know the righteous acts of the Lord." Do you notice how he's speaking to them at that time and saying, you are part of this collective that goes way back in history? You are a part of something bigger than your immediate time. What is our culture all about? Here, now, me. God says to his people, you are a part of this. And he's saying, that history is your history. And the point is so that you might know the righteous acts of the Lord. Now, you included those people in the past, but you also includes the people in the present. And so when God speaks in the law to his people, he is also speaking for all time, in a sense, to teach. Just as the Holy Spirit says to us in the Psalms, Hebrews chapter 3 and 4. And so we have this picture of this is a universal and unending message that we are to learn from, just as God's people in the time of Micah were to learn. All right, so as we close, number 5, what do quotations from and allusions to the Pentateuch in the rest of the Old Testament tell you about the value of the Pentateuch and the unity of the Old Testament? So, after looking at all these passages, what is your big takeaway from all this?
Used the word earlier, but the word that can come to mind for me is foundational. You know, all of this really collapses the Pentateuch. Number one, it's not given from God. It's actually
Absolutely. Chris?
With that, what came to my mind was it's timeless. That no matter what man says, and in their time, hundreds of years past, they'd say, well, that was, look at what happened in the past. That's not important to us, just like we do over and over, generation to generation. And God has always established my word stands forever.
Absolutely. And so what the people of the Old Testament had to learn is God has spoken, and therefore he is still speaking. And when you all study the quotations in the New Testament, God has spoken, and he is still speaking. And these connections help us to see that. Thank you for your participation this morning.